The song America the Beautiful has an extra special connection with me. When I was 14 years old, I climbed Pikes Peak for the first time, and I still remember stopping along the trail to read a small plaque on a rock as we neared the summit. The words on that simple plaque indicated that this was the place that inspired many of the words from Catherine Lee Bates' wonderful poem, which became the song. That fall, I started high school right across the street from the original Colorado Springs Hotel, where Miss Bates hastily jotted down the original words to America the Beautiful in a notebook following her own inspirational journey to the top of Pikes Peak. And a little secret, she called the original poem Pikes Peak. Catherine Lee Bates' story stuck with me. In addition to her writing and teaching, Catherine Lee Bates was also a social activist interested in the struggles of women, workers, people of color, and poor people. In the UUFB services, we often quote or reference persons with a Unitarian or Universalist background, and although I couldn't confirm it, Miss Bates, the daughter of a Congregationalist minister, certainly displayed many traits consistent with the principles of Unitarian Universalism. She wrote and spoke extensively about the need for social reform and was an avid advocate for the global peace movement that emerged after World War I. When I researched Catherine Lee Bates for this service, I also found that she was actively involved in immigration issues around the turn of the century in her hometown of Boston. Americans of Catherine Lee Bates' day, wrote one biographer in a piece last November during the week of our last presidential election, were as politically divided as Americans of this day. Arguably, they were more divided over everything from immigration to land use to racial justice to economic inequality. And her America was similar to this America in more ways too. It was wondrous and cruel, rich and poor, merciless and merciful, beautiful and ugly. So that's my long segue to today. As Sandra mentioned, the 245th anniversary of this country's Declaration of Independence from the Kingdom of Great Britain. From the words and action of Catherine Lee Bates, along with the colonists' original demand on that 4th of July, 1776, for certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I want to reflect this morning a bit on citizenship. First, a short confession. I was born an alien. No. I wasn't born on another planet, just somewhere outside of the country. Officially, I am a naturalized citizen of the United States. My parents used to tell the story of the first time they brought me into the country. When I was a baby, they were delayed by U.S. immigration officials and forced to fill out paperwork they had missed completing prior to the trip. My parents say I wasn't undocumented. They just didn't have all of the necessary documents. Not a huge delay. Maybe a couple of hours, probably no more of a delay than trying to get into Yellowstone National Park this 4th of July weekend. As far as persons born in foreign countries seeking a path to U.S. citizenship, I was very lucky. My father was born in Kansas, my mother in Minnesota. I just happened to come along while our family was living in northern British Columbia. The family genealogy on both parents' sides is loaded with many ancestors who, long before I came along, did all of the dirty work with immigration and citizenship after first coming ashore in North America in the 18th and 19th centuries. I am sure many of you here or watching this services this morning have similar stories. When my ancestors arrived in this country, most spoke no English or a form of English understood only by those from the same country. All of them sought a better life than the one they had left, which included religious persecution, war, and famine, the reason for leaving their home countries. The earliest generations of my ancestors had the biggest challenges in assimilating in their new country. learning a new language, finding work, finding land, clearing the land, and even fulfilling years of obligation as an indentured worker in exchange for the passage on the ship to the United States. Sometimes I wonder if my own immigrant ancestors ever thought about how their own children and future generations would fare in this new country in the years to come. I wish I could tell my ancestors how much I appreciate everything they did to allow for me to be here today. The common thinking on the history of our country's immigration policy after gaining our independence from England is that it was generally a big, wide open door into the new United States. And it was, as long as you were white and if you were from the continental Europe. Early American immigration policy was actually based on obtaining immigrants from European countries by insisting to their rulers that their citizens be given the freedom to exit. And so they came, including my ancestors. Not lost on me is that for a person of color, immigration to America and the path to citizenship was a completely different story. Unlike my ancestors, most Black Americans arrived on this continent without choice. By partial definition, slaves were immigrants, having moved to a country in which they were not natives or citizens to settle. The decision to migrate, though, much less citizenship, was never a choice. Citizenship was not granted to Black Americans until the passing of the 14th Amendment in 1868, 92 years after the Declaration of Independence, and nearly 250 years after the first documented slaves arrived in what is now Virginia in 1619. The right for Black men to vote, though, was not addressed until the 15th Amendment in 1870. Despite those amendments, states began passing Jim Crow laws, enforcing strict racial segregation and denying Black men of their rights. And the ugliness of our country's dealing with the race wasn't exclusive to Black Americans. In 1882, for example, Congress passed an act banning all immigration from China. Now, back to 2021. Immigration and the path to citizenship in this country, as we know, remain hot topics. The estimated number of undocumented immigrants living in the United States today ranges from 10.5 million to 12 million, roughly 10 times the population of the entire state of Montana, to put it in perspective. Like my ancestors, these immigrants might also be here due to religious persecution, war, famine, and you can probably add gang violence and drug cartels to the list of reasons. For the undocumented immigrant, the stakes are high. Getting caught likely means deportation from the United States, a huge disruption with the family finances, and, worst of all, the breaking apart of a family. Meanwhile, their path to long-term legal status, either permanent residence or U.S. citizenship, that unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness remains a very difficult path indeed. I might grumble a little as to why America the Beautiful is not our national anthem, as I think it's easier to sing. And as I mentioned before, I'm partial to the song. The Star-Spangled Banner is the story of the enduring will of a young nation to survive, perhaps best illustrated with those words, "And the flag was still there," after the writer of that poem, Francis Scott Keyes, witnessed the bombardment of Fort McHenry by British naval vessels in Baltimore's harbor in 1814. It's a great choice, and it's the words, not the music, that ultimately makes the national anthem. In addition to the beautiful scenery, Catherine Lee Bates' lyrics also touch on the people who live in this great country. At the close of many of the verses of America the Beautiful, Miss Bates wrote these memorable words: "And crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea." From sea to shining sea, of course, refers to the fact that this country encompasses a huge geographic area stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In the line before, the word crown is a verb, meant as the final triumphant act that finishes a long effort. The final event to crown the goodness of the country that is our United States should be to maintain an attitude of brotherhood. We have a long way to go, but there is much to gain, even when we treat everyone like a brother or a sister.
The Declaration of Independence states lofty ideals about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We know that all those ideals did not apply at the time to women, men who didn't own property, Native Americans, people of color, people who were enslaved, or people in prison. And as Phil Oakes has reminded us, many people still struggle to get the government and our society to recognize that they are deserving of these rights. Yet many people who were left out of having these rights apply to them will be celebrating the birth of our nation today. When the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1788, it too stated lofty aims. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty, unto ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. But in order to be ratified in many states, Congress already had to promise to amend the Constitution to make it, I guess, a more perfect union with a Bill of Rights, the purpose of which was to try to balance the power of the federal government with the rights of individuals and with the states. I believe we can celebrate the progress we have made in extending life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to everyone. At the same time, recognize that, as Paul said, we have a long way to go. I believe we can be inspired by the words in our founding documents and at the same time work to make we the people more universal and inclusive. Looking back in history, it's interesting to see the major turning points in our journey to a more perfect union. One of the most significant, Paul mentioned, and that is the 14th Amendment to the Constitution in 1868. It was put in shortly after the Civil War, and it has been dubbed the center of the promise of America. This amendment was the first time in our Constitution that the words citizen and equality were even mentioned, and that is why it's so powerful. It says in part, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That word person here is very important, and I'll come back to it later. Since the adoption of the 14th Amendment, it has been used to end Jim Crow and unfair voting practices, to address civil rights, gender equality, LGBTQ rights, and justice for immigrants. I believe we're moving in the right direction, but like so many of you, I've been very dismayed by the steps we've taken backwards in recent years. I want to share some ideas I gleaned from the Netflix series Amend, The Fight for America. And let me just pause to give credit to Norm Eggert, because he's the one that shared with our humanist group this particular Netflix series, and I recommend it to all of you. It's narrated by Will Smith. This series helped me understand how our nation has moved in fits and starts toward the promise of America for all, and reminded me of the many obstacles we still face. The series premiered this year in 6 episodes. Each episode highlights a specific way that the 14th Amendment was used to expand the notion of citizenship and equality. Each episode gives historical perspective and brings it up to date. In the episode on citizen, I found out that the 14th Amendment has been used in litigation way more often than any other part of the Constitution, including the right to free speech and the other rights in the First Amendment. Paul addressed many of these issues in his presentation. The second episode, though, brings us up short. Although the ideas in the 14th Amendment were wonderful and inspiring, resistance immediately followed. That resistance was in the form of violence, court rulings, and the belief that defending the Confederacy was heroic. One narrator said, every revolution has an equal and counter-revolution. Most Southern whites did not want that amendment. They would lose power. Resistance to Reconstruction was violent with the advent of the Ku Klux Klan. Backlash included a Supreme Court ruling that stated that the enforcement of the 14th Amendment would be left up to the states and not the federal government. This allowed states, especially in the South, to ignore the Equal Protection Clause and led to atrocities such as the Tulsa race riot. And separate but equal in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896 became the norm in many Southern states for over 60 years. Each state also was able to set up its own rules for voting, resulting in Mississippi having only 6% of its black population registered to vote in the early 1960s. The next episode, however, kind of comes back with the revolution, and we have Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s pushing to get our government and our society to move toward sharing that power that we should all have with everyone. He used civil disobedience to try to force President John Kennedy into action to enforce the 14th Amendment. And although black people came out in force for Kennedy, he was very reluctant to do that because he would lose the support of the Southern Democrats. He wanted to wait for a more opportune time. But as one narrator in the series says, when marginalized people stand up for their God-given rights, they are often asked to wait. Kennedy finally acted by forcing Alabama to allow black students into the University of Alabama, and under President Lyndon Johnson, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed. But back to the revolution, counter-revolution, these gains are being eroded today. The women's movement is featured in this series, and they use the 14th Amendment to try to apply equal protection based on gender. The word person, again, is in the amendment, not male person. Arguments for issues such as reproductive rights, equal pay for equal work, and the Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution were made on this basis. The push for ERA was personal for me. I grew up in rural Illinois, and the pros and cons of the Equal Rights Amendment often centered around two Illinois women. Betty Friedan from Peoria wrote The Feminist Mystique, and Phyllis Schlafly from Alton led the counter-revolution. I was able to spend time with both women when I helped put on a debate between them at Illinois State University. To say that was an interesting weekend is a true understatement. Friedan argued that women had bought into the idea they could only be whole through marriage and family. Schlafly raised the specter of young girls being drafted under ERA, and she argued that women had it made because their husbands would support them. The reasoning behind her thinking is wrong in so many ways I can't even begin to address them. But she was successful in stopping the Equal Rights Amendment from getting 38 states to ratify it. In January 1973, the Supreme Court issued a landmark decision, again based on the 14th Amendment, in Roe versus Wade, stating that the Due Process Clause provides a right to privacy that protects a pregnant woman's right to choose whether or not to have an abortion. And then, of course, this ruling is at the core of conflict today. It's a major and effective rallying cry for the modern Republican Party. Amend also addresses marriage equality and gay rights. After decades of setbacks, the struggle for same-sex marriage equality culminated in an Ohio couple taking a case to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2015. The landmark case was Obergefell versus Hodges. The couple were married in Maryland in 2013, where Maryland allowed gay marriage, but Ohio would not recognize their relationship. They filed a lawsuit alleging the state discriminates against same-sex couples who've married lawfully out of state. So this goes back to that point that allowing the states to decide whether or not to enforce the 14th Amendment really came into play here. Because one partner was terminally ill, they wanted Ohio to identify the other partner as the surviving spouse on the death certificate. But the state attorney general's office announced plans to defend Ohio's same-sex marriage ban, and the case went to the Supreme Court. On June 26, 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment required that a state must license two people of the same sex who were married lawfully out of state. And for those of us who were in Bozeman, I was moved to tears when I found out that our minister, Reverend Nina Gray, was just about the first person down to the courthouse to start performing marriages. And of course, the pushback came, trying to restrict gay couples from adopting children, for example, and today in discrimination against transgender people in terms of bathroom bills and restricting participation in sports. The final segment of Amend goes back to Paul's words because it says that the 14th Amendment can be applied to immigrants, to those people who are living in the country undocumented, because the 14th Amendment uses the word person. That is so absolutely true. Immigrants have long put their hope in America, but intolerant policies, racism, and violence have frequently trampled their dreams. Thank you for bearing with my brief history lesson on the 14th Amendment. The teacher in me just sneaks out sometimes. But the message I thought was so important to us today, when the people of this country try to make this country live up to its ideals, there's always resistance. And that resistance goes against not only our values as a nation, but our principles as Unitarian Universalists. Phil Oak's words today are so very relevant. Quote, "But our land is still troubled by men who have hate. They twist away our freedom and they twist away our fate. Fear is their weapon and treason is their cry. We can stop them if we try," unquote. I would like to conclude, however, with words from Susan Frederick Gray, the UUA president, because in a way she's responding to some of the concerns Phil Oakes raises. Quote, "True democracy is inclusive, and we have a stake in helping to determine our country's future. Living the values of Unitarian Universalism calls us to do what is not easy. They call us to audaciously imagine a world where no one is disposable and where everyone can thrive. It is easy to feel overwhelmed by the significant challenges before us in combating white supremacy and in defending democracy against attacks that persist in myriad systemic forms, including the new restrictive voter registration laws. Let us draw strength, joy, and hope from one another, and for all that we have accomplished. May it inspire us to keep dreaming big, to keep moving forward, to keep organizing for liberation, and to keep answering the call for love and justice," unquote.